unforgettable. A single decision split God's people forever. Welcome to Fern Kings, where the fate of Israel hangs by a thread and every choice echoes through eternity. This book isn't just ancient history, it's the DNA of biblical prophecy. Here, Solomon builds the temple that defines worship for 1,000 years. Elijah establishes the prophetic ministry that points to Christ. The kingdom divides, creating the crisis that drives every Old Testament story afterward. Miss 1 Kings, and you'll never understand why Jesus cleansed the temple, why he's called the Son of David, or why the prophets spoke of restoration. From golden calves to burning altars, from palace coups to divine encounters. 1 Kings contains the most explosive moments in biblical history. These aren't just stories, they're the foundation stones of redemption itself. Ready to see how one book holds the key to understanding God's entire plan? Let's dive into 1 Kings like you've never seen it before. King David was dying. The great warrior who had killed Goliath and conquered Jerusalem now lay shivering in his bed, unable to get warm even with thick blankets. His servants brought him a beautiful young woman named Abishag from Shunem to keep him warm. But as chapter 1 verse 4 tells us, the king did not know her. While David grew weaker, his son Adonijah saw his chance. Chapter 1 verse 5 says, Adonijah the son of Haggith exalted himself, saying, I will be king. He was handsome and had never been disciplined by his father. Like his dead brother Absalom before him, Adonijah got chariots and horses and 50 men to run ahead of him through the streets of Jerusalem. Adonijah wasn't acting alone. 2 powerful men joined his cause, Joab, the commander of David's army, and Abiathar the priest. These weren't small allies. Joab had led Israel's forces for decades, and Abiathar was one of only 2 high priests. With their support, Adonijah felt confident enough to make his move. The rebel prince threw a huge feast at En-Rogel, near Jerusalem. He invited all his brothers except Solomon, and all the men of Judah who served the king. Chapter 1 verse 9 records that Adonijah sacrificed sheep and oxen and fattened cattle by the stone of Zoheleth. Everyone knew this wasn't just a party, it was a coronation feast. But some key people weren't invited. Nathan the prophet stayed away, along with Zadok the priest, Benaiah the warrior, and Solomon himself. These men remained loyal to David's original choice for the throne. Nathan the prophet realized the danger immediately. He rushed to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, with urgent news. Have you not heard that Adonijah has become king, and David our Lord does not know it? He asked in verse 11. Nathan warned her that if Adonijah succeeded, both she and Solomon would be counted as criminals and executed. Together, they devised a plan. Bathsheba would go to David first and remind him of his promise that Solomon would be king. Then Nathan would arrive and confirm her words. The plan worked perfectly. Bathsheba entered David's room and bowed low. She reminded the dying king of his oath. You swore by the Lord your God to your servant, saying, Solomon, your son shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne. While she was still speaking, Nathan arrived and repeated the same message. David's response was immediate and powerful. The old fire flashed in his eyes as he called for Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the commander. His voice rang with authority as he declared in verse 30, As I swore to you by the Lord God of Israel, saying, Your son Solomon shall be king after me, so I will certainly do this day. Within hours, Solomon was riding David's own royal mule down to Gihon's spring. Zadok took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon as king. When they blew the trumpet, chapter 1 verse 40 says, All the people went up after him. And the people played the flutes and rejoiced with great joy, so that the earth seemed to split with their sound. The noise reached Adonijah's feast, just as they finished eating. When Jonathan arrived with news that David had made Solomon king and the whole city was celebrating, Adonijah's guests scattered in terror. The would-be king himself ran to the altar and grabbed its horns, begging for mercy. Solomon's first decision as king showed remarkable wisdom. He told Adonijah in verse 52, "If he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth, but if wickedness is found in him, he shall die." It was a warning wrapped in mercy. After David's death, Solomon established himself as king, but he faced enormous challenges. Chapter 2 shows him systematically removing threats to his throne. When Adonijah foolishly asked to marry Abishag, David's young caretaker, Solomon saw through the request. It was another grab for royal power. He ordered Adonijah's immediate execution. Solomon also dealt with Joab, the old commander who had supported Adonijah and murdered innocent men in the past. Even though Joab fled to the altar for sanctuary, Solomon ordered his death, telling Benaiah in chapter 2 verse 31, "Do as he has said, and strike him down and bury him, that you may take away the innocent blood which Joab shed." With the internal threats removed, Solomon could focus on governing. Chapter 3 verse 3 tells us Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David. But there was one problem. The temple hadn't been built yet, so people sacrificed at high places scattered throughout the land. Solomon went to Gibeon because it housed the most important high place. The great bronze altar that Moses had made in the wilderness stood there. Chapter 3 verse 4 records that Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. It was an incredible display of devotion, 1,000 sacrifices in one ceremony. That night, God appeared to Solomon in a dream. The Almighty offered him anything he wanted, saying in verse 5, "Ask, what shall I give you?" It was every person's fantasy, a blank check from God himself. Most young kings would have asked for long life, great wealth, or victory over their enemies. But Solomon's response surprised everyone, including God. The young king admitted his inexperience, saying in verse 7, "I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in." Then he made his request, "Give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil." God was so pleased with Solomon's humble request that verse 12 records his generous response. "I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall any like you arise after you." But God didn't stop there. He also promised Solomon riches and honor beyond any other king, and long life if he continued to obey. Solomon's wisdom wasn't just a nice gift to keep on a shelf. It had to work in the real world. Soon after his divine encounter, 2 women came before him with a case that would test his judgment. Both were prostitutes, and both claimed the same living baby as their own. The scene in chapter 3, verse 16, was heartbreaking. Then 2 women who were harlots came to the king and stood before him. One woman told a tragic story. She and the other woman lived in the same house and had given birth just 3 days apart. During the night, the other woman's baby died because she had accidentally rolled over on him. Then, according to the first woman, her roommate switched the babies while she slept. The second woman flatly denied the story. She insisted the living child was hers and the dead one belonged to her accuser. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no way to prove who was telling the truth. It seemed impossible to solve. Solomon listened carefully to both women, then called for a sword. What happened next shocked everyone in the throne room. The king declared in verse 25, "Divide the living child in 2, and give half to one and half to the other." It seemed like the wisdom of Solomon had failed catastrophically. But then the true genius of his plan revealed itself. One woman immediately agreed to the division, saying coldly, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." But the real mother's heart broke at the thought of her child being killed. She cried out desperately in verse 26, "O my Lord, give her the living child, and by no means kill him." Solomon smiled and pointed to the woman who would rather lose her child than see him die. Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother. The wisdom was perfect. Only a real mother would sacrifice her own claim to save her child's life. When word of this judgment spread throughout Israel, chapter 3, verse 28 says, "All Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to administer justice." Solomon didn't just make wise individual decisions. He completely reorganized Israel's government to run efficiently. Chapter 4 lists his cabinet members, starting with Azariah the son of Zadok as priest. He had secretaries, a recorder, commanders of the army, and governors over different regions. But Solomon's masterstroke was dividing the entire kingdom into 12 administrative districts, each with its own governor. These weren't based on the old tribal boundaries. Solomon redrew the map for maximum efficiency. Each district was responsible for providing food and supplies for the royal household for 1 month out of the year. The system was brilliant in its simplicity. Chapter 4, verse 7 explains, Solomon had 12 governors over all Israel who provided food for the king and his household. Each one made provision for 1 month of the year. No single region was overburdened, and the king's household never lacked anything. The daily requirements were staggering. Verse 22 lists Solomon's daily provision: 30 cors of fine flour, 60 cors of meal, 10 fatted oxen, 20 oxen from the pastures, 100 sheep, besides deer, gazelles, roebucks, and fatted fowl. This wasn't just for Solomon's family. It fed his entire court, guards, servants, and visitors. Solomon's administrative system created unprecedented prosperity. Chapter 4, verse 20 paints an incredible picture. Judah and Israel were as numerous as the sand by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and rejoicing. The kingdom had never seen anything like it. Solomon's influence stretched far beyond Israel's borders. His kingdom extended from the Euphrates River in the north to the border of Egypt in the south. All the nations in between brought tribute and served Solomon throughout his reign. Verse 25 gives us the famous description of peace. Judah and Israel dwelt safely, each man under his vine and his fig tree, from Dan as far as Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. 4 years into his reign, Solomon was ready to tackle the greatest building project in Israel's history. He reached out to Hiram, king of Tyre, who had been a friend and ally of David. Solomon's message was straightforward and honest, as recorded. In chapter 5, verse 3, "You know how my father David could not build a house for the name of the Lord his God, because of the wars which were fought against him on every side, until the Lord put his foes under the soles of his feet. But now everything had changed." Solomon continued, "But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor evil occurrence. And behold, I propose to build a house for the name of the Lord my God." He asked Hiram for cedar trees from Lebanon and promised to pay whatever wages Hiram demanded for his workers. Hiram was delighted with Solomon's request. Chapter 5, verse 7 records his response: "Blessed be the Lord this day, for he has given David a wise son over this great people." The two kings quickly worked out the details of their partnership. The scale of the operation was massive. Hiram would provide cedar and cypress logs from Lebanon's famous forests. In return, Solomon would give him 20,000 cors of wheat and 20 cors of pure oil every year for his household. It was an enormous trade agreement that would last throughout the temple's construction. Solomon also organized a huge workforce within Israel. Chapter 5, verse 13 reveals the numbers. King Solomon raised up a labor force out of all Israel, and the labor force was 30,000 men. These weren't slaves. They were Israelite citizens serving their kingdom in rotating shifts. The work schedule was carefully planned. 10,000 men would go to Lebanon for 1 month, then return home for 2 months, while the next group took their place. This way, no one was away from home for too long, but the work never stopped. Solomon had additional workers for local tasks. He employed 70,000 men to carry materials and 80,000 to cut stones in the mountains. Over 3,300 supervisors managed the various work crews. Chapter 5, verse 18 tells us that Solomon's builders, Hiram's builders, and the Gebalites quarried them, and they prepared timber and stones to build the temple. Solomon understood that Israel's golden age required more than just internal organization. It needed smart diplomacy with neighboring nations. His most shocking political move was marrying Pharaoh's daughter. Egypt had been Israel's ancient enemy, the land of slavery and oppression. But chapter 3, verse 1 records that Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married Pharaoh's daughter. This wasn't a romantic decision. It was brilliant. International politics. The marriage alliance secured Israel's southern border and opened up trade routes that had been closed for generations. Pharaoh even gave Solomon the captured city of Gaza as a wedding gift, after destroying it and killing its Canaanite inhabitants. The alliance with Hiram of Tyre went far beyond a simple business arrangement. These two kings genuinely respected each other and became close friends. Chapter 5, verse 12 emphasizes this: "The Lord gave Solomon wisdom, as he had promised him. And there was peace between Hiram and Solomon, and the two of them made a treaty." Solomon's diplomatic skills created a network of peaceful relationships throughout the region. Trade caravans could travel safely from Egypt to Mesopotamia through Israeli territory. Merchant ships from distant lands brought exotic goods to Israel's ports. The young king had transformed Israel from an isolated hill country into the crossroads of the ancient world. These alliances weren't just profitable, they were essential for the temple project. The cedar of Lebanon was the finest building material available, but Israel had no access to it without Hiram's cooperation. The skilled craftsmen of Tyre possessed techniques that Israelite workers had never learned. Without these international partnerships, the temple could never have been built. Finally, in Solomon's 4th year as king, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Chapter 6, verse 1 marks the historic date with precision, and it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. The timing was perfect. It had been exactly 480 years since the Exodus from Egypt, and now God's people were finally building a permanent home for his presence among them. The location was Mount Moriah, the same place where Abraham had nearly sacrificed Isaac and where David had built an altar after the plague. The temple's measurements were precisely specified. Chapter 6, verse 2 gives us the dimensions. The house which King Solomon built for the Lord. Its length was 60 cubits, its width 20, and its height 30 cubits. Every detail mattered because this wasn't just any building, it was God's earthly dwelling place. The construction process was remarkable for its reverence. All the stones were cut and shaped at the quarry, so that verse 7 tells us the house, when it was being built, was built with stone finished at the quarry, so that no hammer or chisel or any iron tool was heard in the house while it was being built. The worksite maintained perfect silence out of respect for the sacred purpose. Solomon used only the finest materials. The walls were lined with cedar boards from floor to ceiling, and every surface was carved with intricate designs. Verse 18 describes the interior. The cedar of the house inside was carved with ornamental buds and open flowers. All was cedar. There was no stone to be seen. The most sacred space was the inner sanctuary, called the Most Holy Place. This was a perfect cube, 20 cubits in length, width and height, where the Ark of the Covenant would rest. Solomon overlaid the entire room with pure gold, making it gleam like the throne room of heaven itself. As construction progressed, God spoke directly to Solomon with both promise and warning. Chapter 6, verse 12 records his words, "Concerning this temple which you are building, if you walk in my statutes, execute my judgments, keep all my commandments, and walk in them, then I will perform my word with you, which I spoke to your father, David." The foundation was being laid not just in stone and gold, but in divine covenant. After 7 years of careful work, the temple was nearly finished. But Solomon wasn't done yet. He wanted to add features that would make everyone who saw them gasp in wonder. Chapter 7, verse 13 tells us that King Solomon sent and brought Huram from Tyre. This wasn't just any craftsman. Huram was a master, worker in bronze, the son of a widow from the tribe of Naphtali and a man from Tyre. Huram's first task was creating 2 massive bronze pillars for the temple entrance. Each pillar stood 18 cubits high and 12 cubits around. Chapter 7, verse 21 records that he set up the pillars by the vestibule of the temple. He set up the right pillar and called its name Jachin, and he set up the left pillar and called its name Boaz. These weren't just decorations. Their names meant he establishes, and in him is strength, declaring God's power to everyone who entered. But Huram's masterpiece was the Molten Sea, an enormous bronze basin that held water for the priests to wash in. Chapter 7, verse 23 describes its incredible size. He made the sea of cast bronze, 10 cubits from one brim to the other. It was completely round. Its height was 5 cubits, and a line of 30 cubits measured its circumference. This giant bowl could hold over 11,000 gallons of water. The sea didn't just sit on the ground, it rested on 12 bronze oxen, 3 facing each direction. Chapter 7, verse 25 explains, "It stood on 12 oxen, 3 looking toward the north, 3 looking toward the west, 3 looking toward the south, and 3 looking toward the east." These oxen represented the 12 tribes of Israel, supporting the worship of God. Huram also made 10 bronze carts with wheels, each carrying a bronze basin. These movable wash stations allowed priests to clean themselves and the sacrifices anywhere. In the temple courtyard, the craftsmanship was extraordinary. Chapter 7, verse 29 describes how, on the panels that were between the frames were lions, oxen, and cherubim. Every piece of bronze work was perfectly crafted. Solomon had Huram make pots, shovels, and bowls, hundreds of items needed for temple worship. Chapter 7, verse 45 lists them, the pots, the shovels, and the bowls. All these articles which Huram made for King Solomon for the house of the Lord were of burnished bronze. The temple gleamed like a jewel set in the hills of Jerusalem. While the temple took 7 years to build, Solomon spent 13 years constructing his own royal complex. This wasn't just a house. It was an entire government center that showed the world Israel's power and wealth. Chapter 7, verse 1 simply states, "But Solomon took 13 years to build his own house. So he finished all his house." The most famous building in the complex was called the House of the Forest of Lebanon. Chapter 7, verse 2 gives us its impressive dimensions. He also built the House of the Forest of Lebanon. Its length was 100 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits, with 4 rows of cedar pillars and cedar beams on the pillars. The building got its name because the cedar pillars looked like a forest of trees. This wasn't just for show. The House of the Forest of Lebanon served as an armory and treasure house. Later we learn that Solomon stored hundreds of golden shields. There, the cedar beams and pillars created a beautiful space that impressed visitors while keeping the kingdom's weapons and wealth secure. Solomon also built the Hall of Pillars, which was 50 cubits long and 30 cubits wide. Chapter 7 verse 6 tells us it had a portico in front of them, and the other pillars and thick beams were in front of them. This was likely where government officials conducted daily business and where foreign ambassadors waited to meet the king. The most important building was the Hall of Judgment, where Solomon held court. Chapter 7 verse 7 explains, "Then he made a hall for the throne, the Hall of Judgment, where he might judge, and it was paneled with cedar from floor to ceiling." This was where Solomon's famous wisdom was displayed as he settled disputes and made royal decisions. Solomon's personal quarters were behind the Hall of Judgment, built with the same expensive materials and careful craftsmanship. He also built a separate house for Pharaoh's daughter, his Egyptian wife. Chapter 7 verse 8 mentions another court inside the hall of like workmanship. Solomon also made a house like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had taken as wife. All these buildings used the finest materials available. The foundations were made of large, expensive stones, some 8 cubits long and some 10 cubits long. Above the foundation, chapter 7 verse 11 tells us, were costly stones hewn to size and cedar wood. Nothing was too good for Solomon's palace. Complex. Finally, the temple was complete and ready for its most important moment. Solomon called together all the leaders of Israel, the tribal heads, the chiefs of families, everyone who mattered in the kingdom. Chapter 8 verse 1 records, "Now Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief fathers of the children of Israel, to King Solomon in Jerusalem, that they might bring up the ark of the covenant of the Lord from the city of David, which is Zion." The ark had been waiting in a tent on Mount Zion ever since David brought it to Jerusalem. Now it would finally have a permanent home in the temple's most sacred room. The ceremony took place during the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month, when all Israel was already gathered in Jerusalem for worship. The priests carefully lifted the ark and began the procession to the temple. Chapter 8 verse 3 tells us, "So all the elders of Israel came, and the priests took up the ark." This wasn't a rushed job. They moved slowly and reverently, understanding the incredible significance of what they were doing. As they carried the ark, Solomon and the people offered so many sacrifices that no one could count them. Chapter 8, verse 5 describes the scene. Also King Solomon and all the congregation of Israel who were assembled with him were with him before the ark, sacrificing sheep and oxen that could not be told or numbered for multitude. The priests brought the ark into the most holy place and positioned it carefully beneath the wings of the golden cherubim. Chapter 8 verse 6 records, "Then the priests brought in the ark of the covenant of the Lord to its place, into the inner sanctuary of the temple, to the most holy place, under the wings of the cherubim. Inside the ark were the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed there at Mount Sinai, the original 10 commandments written by God's own finger." Then something incredible happened. As the priests came out of the most holy place, chapter 8, verse 10 tells us, "It came to pass, when the priests came out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord." God's presence filled the temple so powerfully that the priests couldn't continue their service. Verse 11 explains, "The priests could not continue ministering because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord." Solomon understood what was happening. He turned to the people and declared in verse 12, "The Lord said he would dwell in the dark cloud. I have surely built you an exalted house and a place for you to dwell in forever." The God of Israel had come to live among his people in a way that had never happened before. Standing before the altar with all Israel watching, Solomon lifted his hands toward heaven and began to pray. His prayer, recorded in chapter 8, is one of the most beautiful and comprehensive prayers in the entire Bible. He started by acknowledging God's faithfulness. "Lord God of Israel, there is no God in heaven above or on earth below like you, who keep your covenant and mercy with your servants, who walk before you with all their hearts." Solomon reminded God of the promise made to his father David about building the temple. Chapter 8, verse 24, records his words, "You have kept what you promised your servant David my father. You have both spoken with your mouth and fulfilled it with your hand, as it is this day." The temple was proof that God keeps his promises. But then Solomon asked a profound question that showed his wisdom. Chapter 8, verse 27 records his wonder, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the heaven of heavens cannot contain you. How much less this temple which I have built?" Solomon understood that no building could actually contain the infinite God. Instead, Solomon asked God to make the temple a place where prayers would be heard. He prayed for 7 different situations when people might need God's help. When they swear oaths, when there's no rain, when enemies attack, when foreigners come seeking God, when armies go to war, when people are taken captive, and when they sin. For each situation, Solomon asked God to hear from heaven your dwelling place, and when you hear, forgive. Solomon's prayer reached its climax as he asked God to be especially attentive to this place. Chapter 8, verse 29 contains his request, "That your eyes may be open toward this temple night and day, toward the place of which you said, 'My name shall be there,' that you may hear the prayer which your servant makes toward this place." When Solomon finished praying, God answered immediately and dramatically. Chapter 8, verse 54 tells us that when Solomon had finished praying all this prayer and supplication to the Lord, he arose from before the altar of the Lord, from kneeling on his knees with his hands spread up to heaven. Then fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings, and God's glory filled the temple again. The people saw God's fire and fell on their faces, worshipping and praising the Lord. The dedication celebration lasted 14 days. 7 days for the temple dedication and 7 days for the Feast of Tabernacles. Chapter 8, verse 66 describes how it ended. On the 8th day he sent the people away, and they blessed the king, and went to their tents joyful and glad of heart for all the good that the Lord had done for his servant David, and for Israel his people. Solomon's wisdom and wealth had become legendary throughout the known world. Stories of his incredible judgment and vast riches traveled along trade routes from Egypt to Mesopotamia. But one ruler decided she had to see for herself if the reports were true. Chapter 10, verse 1 introduces her. Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Sheba was likely in southern Arabia, over 1,000 miles from Jerusalem. For a queen to make such a dangerous journey with a large caravan showed how much Solomon's reputation had spread. She brought gifts worthy of her royal status. Chapter 10, verse 2 tells us she came with a very great retinue, with camels that bore spices, very much gold, and precious stones. The queen didn't come just to exchange pleasantries. She had prepared difficult questions to test whether Solomon's wisdom was real or just clever stories. Chapter 10, verse 3 records the result. So Solomon answered all her questions. There was nothing so difficult for the king that he could not explain it to her. Nothing she asked could stump him, but the queen's amazement went beyond Solomon's answers. She toured his palace, saw his government in action, watched his officials at work, and observed the temple worship. Chapter 10, verse 4 describes her reaction. And when the Queen of Sheba had seen all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his servants, the service of his waiters and their apparel, his cupbearers, and his entryway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. The queen was literally breathless. Everything she saw exceeded the stories she had heard. Chapter 10, verse 6 records her confession. It was a true report, which I heard in my own land, about your words and your wisdom. However, I did not believe. the words until I came and saw with my own eyes, and indeed the half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity exceed the fame of which I heard. She praised Solomon's people and his God, saying in verse 9, Blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you, setting you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord has loved Israel forever, therefore he made you king, to do justice and righteousness. Here was a pagan queen acknowledging that Israel's God was the source of Solomon's success. The gifts she gave Solomon were extraordinary. Chapter 10, verse 10 lists them. Then she gave the king 120 talents of gold, spices in great quantity, and precious stones. There never again came such abundance of spices as the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. In return, Solomon gave her everything she asked for, plus additional gifts from his royal bounty. Solomon's wealth had reached levels that seemed almost impossible to believe. Gold flowed into Jerusalem from every direction, making the precious metal so common that silver was considered worthless. Chapter 10, verse 14 gives us the staggering annual total. The weight of gold that came to Solomon yearly was 666 talents of gold. That's roughly 25 tons of gold every single year. The gold came from multiple sources. Trade caravans paid taxes as they passed through Israel's territory. Merchant ships brought tribute from distant lands. The famous gold of Ophir arrived regularly on Solomon's fleet of ships. Chapter 10, verse 22 describes these trading expeditions. For the king had merchant ships at sea with the fleet of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the merchant ships came bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. Solomon used this wealth to create objects of incredible beauty and value. He made 200 large shields of beaten gold, each containing 600 shekels of gold. He also crafted 300 smaller shields with 3 minas of gold each. Chapter 10, verse 17 tells us that the king put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. These weren't for battle, they were symbols of wealth and power. The king's throne was a masterpiece that left visitors speechless. Chapter 10, verse 18 describes it. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with pure gold. The throne had 6 steps leading up to it, with lions standing on each step. Verse 20 adds, 12 lions stood there, 1 on each side of the 6 steps. Nothing like this had been made for any other kingdom. Solomon's daily life reflected his incredible wealth. All his drinking cups were made of gold. Chapter 10, verse 21 says, All the drinking vessels of King Solomon were gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were pure gold. Not one was silver, for this was accounted as nothing. In the days of Solomon, silver was so common that it was practically worthless. The king's stables housed thousands of horses and chariots. Chapter 10, verse 26 gives us the numbers. And Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. These weren't just for show. They represented military power that kept Israel's enemies at bay. Solomon also controlled the international horse and chariot trade. Kings from Egypt to the Hittites bought their military equipment through Solomon's dealers. Chapter 10, verse 29 explains, Now a chariot that was imported from Egypt cost 600 shekels of silver, and a horse 150. And thus, through their agents, they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. At the height of his power and wealth, Solomon made decisions that would destroy everything he had built. His love for foreign women became an obsession that led him away from the God who had given him everything. Chapter 11, verse 1 reveals the scope of the problem. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. These weren't just random relationships. They were political marriages designed to cement alliances with surrounding nations. but God had specifically warned Israel about such marriages. Chapter 11 verse 2 reminds us, "From the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods." Solomon knew the danger but chose to ignore it. The numbers were staggering. Chapter 11 verse 3 gives us the shocking total, "And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned away his heart. 1,000 women from pagan nations, each bringing her own gods and religious practices, into Solomon's household." At first, Solomon probably thought he could handle it. He was the wisest man who ever lived. Surely he could marry foreign women without being influenced by their religions. But chapter 11 verse 4 reveals the tragic truth. "For it was so, when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David." The corruption was gradual but devastating. Solomon began building high places for his wives' gods right outside Jerusalem. Chapter 11 verse 7 records his shocking betrayal. "Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem, and for Moloch, the abomination of the people of Ammon." These weren't just shrines. They were active worship centers where terrible rituals took place. Chemosh demanded child sacrifice from the Moabites. Moloch was even worse. Children were burned alive in his bronze arms, while drums drowned out their screams. The same Solomon who had built God's temple was now providing places for his wives to sacrifice children to demon gods. Chapter 11 verse 8 shows how far Solomon had fallen, "And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods." The man whom God had appeared to twice, who had prayed the greatest dedication prayer in history, was now enabling pagan worship in the Holy Land. God's patience with Solomon finally reached its limit. The Lord appeared to Solomon for the third time, but this visit brought judgment instead of blessing. Chapter 11 verse 9 explains God's anger. "So the Lord became angry with Solomon, because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Despite all God's blessings and warnings, Solomon had chosen other gods. God's judgment was swift and terrible." Chapter 11 verse 11 records his sentence. "Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this, and have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you, and give it to your servant." The united kingdom that David had built and Solomon had glorified would be ripped apart. But God's mercy tempered his justice. Because of his love for David, the punishment would be delayed. Chapter 11 verse 12 explains, "Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days, for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son." Solomon would die as king of a united Israel, but his son would lose most of the kingdom. God also promised to preserve a remnant for David's sake. Verse 13 records his commitment. "However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem which I have chosen." The line of David would continue, but barely. The judgment began immediately through Solomon's enemies. God stirred up Hadad the Edomite, who had escaped to Egypt as a child when David conquered Edom. Chapter 11 verse 14 introduces him. "Now the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon, Hadad the Edomite. He was a descendant of the king in Edom. Hadad had grown up in Pharaoh's court, married into the royal family, and now returned to cause trouble for Solomon. Another enemy was Rezon, who had fled from his master and became the leader of a band of raiders. Chapter 11 verse 23 tells us, "And God raised up another adversary against him, Rezon the son of Eliada, who had fled from his master, Hadad-ezer king of Zobah. Rezon captured Damascus and became king of Syria, creating a constant threat on Israel's northern border, but the most dangerous enemy was internal. Jeroboam was one of Solomon's own officials, a capable man from the tribe of Ephraim. Chapter 11, verse 28 describes his rise. The man Jeroboam was a valiant warrior, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he made him the officer over all the labor force of the house of Joseph. One day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, he met the prophet Ahijah on the road. The prophet was wearing a new cloak, and in a dramatic gesture, he tore it into 12 pieces. Chapter 11, verse 30 describes the scene. Then Ahijah took hold of the new garment that was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. Ahijah gave 10 pieces to Jeroboam and delivered a shocking prophecy. Chapter 11, verse 31 records God's message. Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and will give 10 tribes to you. Jeroboam would become king of the northern tribes when Solomon died. When Solomon heard about Ahijah's prophecy, he tried to kill Jeroboam. But chapter 11 verse 40 tells us, Solomon therefore sought to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak king of Egypt, and was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. The future king of northern Israel waited in exile while Solomon's kingdom crumbled from within. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam should have inherited the most powerful kingdom in the ancient world. Instead, he was about to make the worst decision in Israel's history. All Israel gathered at Shechem to make him king, but they had concerns about his father's harsh policies. Chapter 12, verse 3 tells us that they sent and called him. The people wanted to talk before crowning their new king. Jeroboam returned from Egypt when he heard about Solomon's death. He joined the northern tribes as their spokesman when they approached Rehoboam. Their request was simple and reasonable. Chapter 12, verse 4 records their words. Your father made our yoke heavy. Now, therefore, lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. Solomon's building projects had required enormous amounts of forced labor. The temple, his palace complex, and all his other construction had taken decades and cost the people dearly in taxes and work crews. Now they were asking for relief, lower taxes, shorter work periods, less government control over their lives. Rehoboam asked for 3 days to consider their request. He first went to the old advisors who had served his father. These experienced men gave him wise counsel in chapter 12, verse 7. If you will be a servant to these people today and serve them and answer them and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. The formula was simple: serve the people and they will serve you. But Rehoboam didn't like this advice. He rejected the wisdom of the elders and instead asked his young friends what they thought. These men had grown up with Rehoboam in the palace, surrounded by luxury and power. They had never worked in the fields or carried stones for Solomon's buildings. The young advisors gave terrible counsel. Chapter 12, verse 10 records their arrogant response. Thus you should speak to this people who have spoken to you, saying, Your father made our yoke heavy, but you make it lighter on us. Thus you shall say to them, My little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. They advised Rehoboam to threaten even harsher treatment. When the 3 days ended, all Israel returned to hear Rehoboam's decision. The young king stood before his people and delivered words that would split the nation forever. Chapter 12, verse 14 records his foolish threat. My father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. The people's reaction was immediate and explosive. Chapter 12, verse 16 captures their angry response. So when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, saying, "What share have we in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. To your tents, O Israel. Now see to your own house, O David." The northern tribes rejected Rehoboam as their king and went home. Rehoboam tried to maintain control by sending Adoram, who was in charge of forced labor, to deal with the rebels. But the people's anger had reached the boiling point. Chapter 12, verse 18 tells us, "Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was in charge of the revenue, but all Israel stoned him with stones, and he died." When Rehoboam saw this, he quickly got in his chariot and fled to Jerusalem. With Rehoboam's authority rejected, the northern tribes needed a new king. They chose Jeroboam, the man who had fled to Egypt to escape Solomon's anger. Chapter 12, verse 20 records his coronation. "So it came to pass, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had come back, they sent for him and called him to the congregation, and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to David's house. Jeroboam now ruled 10 tribes, but he had a serious problem. Jerusalem, with its magnificent temple, was in Rehoboam's territory. If his people continued going there for the required festivals, their hearts might turn back to the house of David. Chapter 12, verse 26 reveals his worry. "And Jeroboam said in his heart, 'Now the kingdom may return to the house of David.'" His thinking made political sense, but it led to spiritual disaster. Chapter 12, verse 27 shows his reasoning. "If these people go up to offer sacrifices in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah." So Jeroboam made 2 golden calves and set them up as alternative worship centers. He placed one in Bethel in the south and another in Dan in the north. Chapter 12, verse 28 records his announcement to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt." This was a catastrophic decision that violated the first and second commandments. Jeroboam wasn't trying to replace God. He claimed these calves represented the Lord who had brought Israel out of Egypt. But God had specifically forbidden making images of himself, and these golden calves reminded everyone of Aaron's terrible mistake in the wilderness. Jeroboam didn't stop with the calves. He built shrines at the high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, not just from the tribe of Levi, as God had commanded. Chapter 12, verse 31 tells us, "He made shrines on the high places and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi." The new king even changed the religious calendar to suit his political needs. Instead of celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles in the 7th month as God commanded, Jeroboam moved it to the 8th month. Chapter 12, verse 32 explains, "Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. He wanted to prevent his people from going to Jerusalem during the real festival. On the day of his new festival, Jeroboam personally went to Bethel to offer sacrifices on the altar he had made. Chapter 12, verse 33 describes the scene. "So he made offerings on the altar which he had made at Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart." Everything about this new religion was invented by Jeroboam to serve his political purposes. While Jeroboam was offering incense at his false altar in Bethel, God sent a prophet from Judah to confront him. This unnamed man of God didn't sneak into the city or wait for a private audience. He boldly interrupted the king's ceremony with a shocking prophecy. Chapter 13, verse 1 sets the dramatic scene. "And behold, a man of God went from Judah to Bethel by the word of the Lord, and Jeroboam stood by the altar to burn incense." The prophet's message was specific and startling. He spoke directly to the altar, not to the king, declaring God's judgment in chapter 13, verse 2. O altar, altar, thus says the Lord, behold, a child, Josiah by name, shall be born to the house of David, and on you he shall sacrifice the priests of the high places who burn incense on you, and men's bones shall be burned on you. This prophecy wouldn't be fulfilled for over 300 years, but it showed that God's judgment was certain. To prove his message was from God, the prophet gave an immediate sign. Chapter 13, verse 3 records his prediction. And he gave a sign the same day, saying, This is the sign which the Lord has spoken. Surely the altar shall split apart, and the ashes on it shall be poured out. God would demonstrate his power right then and there. Jeroboam was furious at this interruption of his ceremony. He pointed at the prophet and shouted for his guards to arrest him. But chapter 13, verse 4 tells us what happened next. So it came to pass, when King Jeroboam heard the saying of the man of God, who cried out against the altar in Bethel, that he stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, Arrest him. Then his hand, which he stretched out toward him, withered, so that he could not pull it back to himself. At the same moment, the altar split apart exactly as the prophet had predicted. Chapter 13, verse 5 describes the scene. The altar also was split apart, and the ashes poured out from the altar, according to the sign which the man of God had given by the word of the Lord. Everyone watching knew they had witnessed divine power. Suddenly humble and terrified, Jeroboam begged the prophet to pray for him. Chapter 13, verse 6 records his desperate plea. Then the king answered and said to the man of God, Please entreat the favor of the Lord your God, and pray for me, that my hand may be restored to me. The man of God prayed, and immediately the king's hand was healed and became normal again. Grateful for his healing, Jeroboam invited the prophet to his house for food and a reward. But the man of God had strict instructions from the Lord. Chapter 13, verse 9 explains his orders. For so it was commanded me by the word of the Lord, saying, You shall not eat bread, nor drink water, nor return by the same way you came. He was to deliver his message and leave immediately without accepting any hospitality. The prophet obeyed and left Bethel by a different road. But his story wasn't over. An old prophet who lived in Bethel heard about what had happened and decided to pursue the man of God. He found him resting under an oak tree and invited him back for a meal. When the man of God explained that he couldn't eat or drink in this place, the old prophet lied to him. Chapter 13, verse 18 records his deception. He said to him, I too am a prophet as you are, and an angel spoke to me by the word of the Lord, saying, Bring him back with you to your house, that he may eat bread and drink water. He was lying to him. Tragically, the man of God believed the lie and returned to eat with the old prophet. While they were sitting at the table, God spoke through the old prophet with a terrible judgment. Chapter 13, verse 21 records the prophecy. And he cried out to the man of God who came from Judah, saying, Thus says the Lord, because you have disobeyed the word of the Lord, and have not kept the commandment which the Lord your God commanded you, your corpse shall not come to the tomb of your fathers. After the meal, the man of God left to return home, but on the way, a lion killed him. Chapter 13, verse 24 describes his death. When he was gone, a lion met him on the road and killed him, and his corpse was thrown on the road, and the donkey stood by it. The lion also stood by the corpse. Strangely, the lion didn't eat the body or attack the donkey. It just stood guard over the dead prophet. Even after witnessing God's power at Bethel, Jeroboam didn't change his ways. Chapter 13, verse 33 tells us, After this event, Jeroboam did not turn from his evil way, but again, he made priests from every class of people for the high places. Whoever wished, he consecrated him, and he became one of the priests of the high places. The king continued his false religion, despite clear warnings from God. But God wasn't finished with Jeroboam. The judgment came through a family crisis that would test the king's faith. Jeroboam's son Abijah became seriously ill, and the king was desperate to know if the boy would live. Chapter 14, verse 1 introduces the crisis. At that time, Abijah the son of Jeroboam became sick. Jeroboam knew he needed to consult a true prophet, not one of his appointed priests. He thought of Ahijah, the old prophet who had first told him he would become king. But there was a problem. Ahijah would recognize Jeroboam and might refuse to give him an answer because of his sins. So Jeroboam came up with a plan. He told his wife to disguise herself and go to Ahijah pretending to be someone else. Chapter 14, verse 2 records his instructions. And Jeroboam said to his wife, "Please arise and disguise yourself, that they may not recognize you as the wife of Jeroboam, and go to Shiloh. Indeed, Ahijah the prophet is there, who told me that I would be king over this people." Jeroboam's wife took gifts for the prophet, bread, cakes, and honey, and traveled to Shiloh where Ahijah lived. But the old prophet was nearly blind by this time, and God had already told him she was coming. Chapter 14, verse 5 reveals God's preparation. Now the Lord had said to Ahijah, "Here is the wife of Jeroboam coming to ask you something about her son, for he is sick. Thus and thus you shall say to her, for it will be when she comes in, that she will pretend to be another woman." When Jeroboam's wife arrived at Ahijah's door, the prophet immediately called out her real identity. Chapter 14, verse 6 records his greeting. And so it was, when Ahijah heard the sound of her footsteps as she came through the door, he said, "Come in, wife of Jeroboam. Why do you pretend to be another person? For I have been sent to you with bad news." Ahijah's message was devastating. He reminded her of how God had taken the kingdom from Solomon's house and given it to Jeroboam, expecting him to follow God's commands like David did. But instead, Jeroboam had done more evil than all the kings before him. Chapter 14, verse 9 contains God's accusation. "But you have done more evil than all who were before you. For you have gone and made for yourself other gods and molded images to provoke me to anger, and have cast me behind your back." The punishment would be complete destruction of Jeroboam's family. Chapter 14, verse 10 records the terrible sentence, "Therefore, behold, I will bring disaster on the house of Jeroboam, and will cut off from Jeroboam every male in Israel bond and free. I will take away the remnant of the house of Jeroboam, as one takes away refuse until it is all gone." The judgment would be especially shameful. Chapter 14, verse 11 describes the fate of Jeroboam's descendants. "The dogs shall eat whoever belongs to Jeroboam and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the field, for the Lord has spoken." This was the most disgraceful end possible. No proper burial, just bodies left for scavengers. But there was one exception. Ahijah told her that her sick son Abijah would die, but he alone would receive a proper burial. Chapter 14, verse 13 explains why. "And all Israel shall mourn for him and bury him, for he is the only one of Jeroboam who shall come to the grave, because in him there is found something good toward the Lord God of Israel in the house of Jeroboam." The prophecy began fulfilling immediately. Chapter 14, verse 17 tells us, "Then Jeroboam's wife arose and departed and came to Tirzah. When she came to the threshold of the house, the child died. As soon as she reached home, her son was dead, exactly as Ahijah had predicted. Meanwhile, in the southern kingdom of Judah, Rehoboam was also facing God's judgment for his failures. Chapter 14, verse 21 tells us he was 41 years old when he became king and reigned 17 years in Jerusalem. His mother was Naamah, an Ammonite woman, another foreign marriage that would influence the kingdom's spiritual direction. Under Rehoboam's weak leadership, Judah abandoned the Lord just as completely as Israel had. Chapter 14, verse 22 describes in their rebellion. Now Judah did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they provoked him to jealousy with their sins which they committed, more than all that their fathers had done. The people built high places, sacred pillars, and wooden images on every high hill and under every green tree. Even worse, chapter 14 verse 24 tells us, "And there were also perverted persons in the land. They did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel." The temple prostitution and child sacrifice that had characterized the Canaanites before Israel's conquest were now happening in the Promised Land again. God's judgment came through Shishak, king of Egypt. In Rehoboam's 5th year, this powerful Pharaoh invaded Judah with a massive army. Chapter 14 verse 25 records the attack. It happened in the 5th year of King Rehoboam that Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. The same Egypt that had once enslaved Israel was now conquering the Promised Land. Shishak's army was enormous and included troops from multiple African nations. Chapter 14 verse 26 describes the devastating loss. "And he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. He also took away all the gold shields which Solomon had made." All the wealth that Solomon had accumulated over decades was carried off to Egypt in a single campaign. The humiliation was complete. Instead of golden shields, Rehoboam had to make bronze ones for his guards. Chapter 14 verse 27 tells us, "Then King Rehoboam made bronze shields in their place, and committed them to the hands of the captains of the guard who guarded the doorway of the king's house." The glory of Solomon's reign was reduced to cheap imitations. When Rehoboam died, his son Abijah became king of Judah. Abijah ruled only 3 years, but he achieved one remarkable military victory against the northern kingdom. Jeroboam came against Judah with 800,000 warriors, while Abijah had only 400,000. Chapter 13 verse 3 gives us these staggering numbers. "And Abijah set the battle in array with an army of valiant warriors, 400,000 choice men. Jeroboam also drew up in battle formation against him with 800,000 choice men, mighty men of valor." Before the battle, Abijah stood on Mount Zemaraim and delivered a powerful speech to Jeroboam's army. He reminded them that God had given the kingdom to David's line forever, and that Jeroboam's rebellion was against God's plan. Chapter 13 verse 8 contains his challenge. "And now you think to withstand the kingdom of the Lord, which is in the hand of the sons of David. And you are a great multitude, and with you are the gold calves, which Jeroboam made for you as gods." While Abijah was speaking, Jeroboam sent troops to attack from behind. When Judah realized they were surrounded, they cried out to the Lord for help. Chapter 13 verse 15 records the turning point. "Then the men of Judah gave a shout, and as the men of Judah shouted, it happened that God struck Jeroboam and all Israel before Abijah and Judah. God fought for Judah and gave them an incredible victory." The defeat was devastating for Israel. Chapter 13 verse 17 tells us, "Then Abijah and his people struck them with a great slaughter. So 500,000 choice men of Israel fell slain." Half of Jeroboam's army was destroyed in one battle. Jeroboam never recovered his strength after this defeat and died shortly afterward. When Abijah died, his son Asa became king of Judah and began one of the most important reform movements in the kingdom's history. Chapter 15 verse 11 immediately establishes his character. Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David. Unlike his father and grandfather, Asa was committed to following God's commands. Asa's reforms were thorough and courageous. He removed all the pagan shrines and idols that had polluted Judah during previous reigns. Chapter 15 verse 12 describes his actions, "And he banished the perverted persons from the land, and removed all the idols that his fathers had made. The temple prostitutes and fertility gods that had corrupted Israel's worship were eliminated, The king's reforms even extended to his own family. His grandmother Maachah had been queen mother, but she had made an obscene image for the goddess, Asherah. Chapter 15 verse 13 tells us about Asa's difficult decision. Also, he removed Maachah, his grandmother, from being queen mother because she had made an obscene image of Asherah. And Asa cut down her obscene image and burned it by the brook Kidron. Asa's heart was completely committed to the Lord, though he didn't remove all the high places. Chapter 15 verse 14 gives us this evaluation. But the high places were not removed. Nevertheless, Asa's heart was loyal to the Lord all his days. Some local worship sites remained, but the king's personal devotion never wavered. The spiritual renewal brought material blessings as well. Asa brought the silver and gold articles that he and his father had dedicated into the temple, restoring some of the wealth that Shishak had taken. Chapter 15 verse 15 records his generosity. He also brought into the house of the Lord the things which his father had dedicated, and the things which he himself had dedicated, silver and gold and utensils. Asa's reign was marked by peace for many years, but eventually he faced a military crisis. Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah and built the city of Ramah to control access to Jerusalem. Chapter 15 verse 17 describes the threat. Now, Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might let none go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. Instead of trusting God as he had in spiritual matters, Asa made a political alliance with Ben-Hadad of Syria. He took silver and gold from the temple and his palace and sent it to Damascus with a message. Chapter 15 verse 19 records his request. Let there be a treaty between you and me, as there was between my father and your father. See, I have sent you a present of silver and gold. Come and break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so that he will withdraw from me. The strategy worked perfectly from a human perspective. Ben-Hadad attacked Israel's northern cities, forcing Baasha to abandon his fortification of Ramah and return home to defend his own territory. Chapter 15 verse 20 tells us, So Ben-Hadad heeded King Asa and sent the captains of his armies against the cities of Israel. He attacked Ijon, Dan, Abel Beth-Maachah, and all Chinneroth, with all the land of Naphtali. When Baasha withdrew, Asa mobilized all of Judah to dismantle the fortifications at Ramah. Chapter 15 verse 22 describes the massive project. Then King Asa made a proclamation throughout all Judah. None was exempted, and they took away the stones and timber of Ramah, which Baasha had built, and with them King Asa built Geba of Benjamin and Mizpah. Asa used Baasha's own materials to strengthen Judah's defenses. Asa reigned for 41 years, making him one of Judah's longest-serving kings. Chapter 15 verse 23 summarizes his accomplishments. The rest of all the acts of Asa, all his might, all that he did, and the cities which he built, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? His reign brought stability and spiritual renewal that would influence Judah for generations. While Asa was bringing reform to Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel was experiencing violent political instability. When Jeroboam died, his son Nadab became king, but his reign lasted only 2 years. Chapter 15 verse 25 tells us, Now Nadab the son of Jeroboam became king over Israel in the 2nd year of Asa king of Judah, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. Nadab followed his father's evil example, continuing the false religion that Jeroboam had established. Chapter 15 verse 26 describes his character. And he did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of his father, and in his sin, by which he had made Israel sin. The golden calves at Dan and Bethel remained, and the corrupt priesthood continued operating. Nadab's reign ended suddenly and violently, while he was besieging the Philistine city of Gibbethon with the Israeli army. One of his own commanders struck him down. Chapter 15, verse 27 records the assassination. Then Baasha the son of Ahijah of the house of Issachar conspired against him, and Baasha killed him at Gibbethon, which belonged to the Philistines, while Nadab and all Israel laid siege to Gibbethon. Baasha didn't just kill Nadab, he completely destroyed Jeroboam's entire family line, exactly as the prophet Ahijah had predicted. Chapter 15, verse 29 tells us, "And it was so, when he became king, that he killed all the house of Jeroboam. He did not leave to Jeroboam anyone that breathed, until he had destroyed him, according to the word of the Lord which he had spoken by his servant Ahijah the Shilonite. The dogs and birds consumed the bodies just as God had warned." Baasha ruled Israel for 24 years, but he learned nothing from Jeroboam's fate. Chapter 15, verse 34 describes his character. "He did evil in the sight of the Lord, and walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin, by which he had made Israel sin." The new dynasty continued the same false religion that had destroyed the previous one. God sent the prophet Jehu to pronounce judgment on Baasha's house. Chapter 16, verse 2 records the divine message, "Inasmuch as I lifted you out of the dust and made you ruler over my people Israel, and you have walked in the way of Jeroboam and have made my people Israel sin to provoke me to anger with their sins." Baasha would face the same judgment that had destroyed Jeroboam. The prophecy declared that Baasha's dynasty would be completely eliminated. Chapter 16, verse 3 contains the terrible sentence, "Surely I will take away the posterity of Baasha and the posterity of his house, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat." History was about to repeat itself with another violent dynasty change. When Baasha died, his son Elah became king of Israel. But Elah's reign lasted only 2 years before he was assassinated in a palace coup. Chapter 16, verse 9 describes his death. "Now his servant Zimri, commander of half his chariots, conspired against him as he was in Tirzah, drinking himself drunk in the house of Asa, steward of his house in Tirzah. Elah was murdered while getting drunk at a party. Zimri immediately fulfilled the prophecy against Baasha's house by killing every male relative." Chapter 16, verse 11 records the massacre. "Then it happened, when he began to reign, as soon as he sat on his throne, that he killed all the household of Baasha. He did not leave him one male, neither of his relatives nor of his friends." Another royal family was completely destroyed for their sins against God. Zimri's reign as king of Israel lasted exactly 7 days, the shortest reign in the Bible. When the Israeli army heard that he had murdered King Elah and seized the throne, they immediately proclaimed their own commander as king. Chapter 16, verse 16 describes their reaction. "Now the people who were encamped heard it said, 'Zimri has conspired and also has killed the king.' So all Israel made Omri, the commander of the army, king over Israel that day in the camp." Omri led the army from their siege of Gibbethon straight to Tirzah, the capital city where Zimri was trying to establish his rule. When Zimri saw that the city was taken and his cause was hopeless, he chose to die rather than be captured. Chapter 16, verse 18 records his dramatic end. "And it happened, when Zimri saw that the city was taken, that he went into the citadel of the king's house and burned the king's house down upon himself with fire and died." Zimri's death didn't immediately solve Israel's leadership crisis. The kingdom split between 2 rival claimants to the throne. Some of the people supported Tibni the son of Ginath, while others backed Omri. Chapter 16, verse 21 describes the civil war. "Then the people of Israel were divided into 2 parts. Half of the people followed Tibni, the son of Ginath, to make him king, and half followed Omri. The civil war lasted for several years, with both sides fighting for control of the northern kingdom. But eventually Omri's supporters proved stronger than Tibni's faction. Chapter 16, verse 22 tells us the outcome. "But the people who followed Omri prevailed over the people who followed Tibni, the son of Ginath. So Tibni died, and Omri became king. Once Omri secured his throne, he made a decision that would change Israel's history. He bought a hill from a man named Shemer and built a new capital city there. Chapter 16, verse 24, records this important move. And he bought the hill of Samaria from Shemer for 2 talents of silver. Then he built on the hill and called the name of the city which he built Samaria after the name of Shemer, owner of the hill. Samaria would remain Israel's capital for the rest of the northern kingdom's existence. Its location was perfect, situated on a hill that could be easily defended, with good access to trade routes, but isolated enough to resist siege warfare. Omri had chosen well from a military and political perspective, but spiritually, Omri was a disaster. Chapter 16, verse 25 gives us God's evaluation of his reign. Omri did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and did worse than all who were before him. Despite his political and military success, Omri continued and even expanded the false religion that had plagued Israel since Jeroboam's time. Omri ruled Israel for 12 years and established a dynasty that would include some of the most wicked kings in biblical history. When he died, his son Ahab became king and would prove to be even more evil than his father. Chapter 16, verse 28, records the transition. So Omri rested with his fathers and was buried in Samaria. Then Ahab, his son, reigned in his place. The stage was now set for the next great confrontation in Israel's history. A new king would arise, who would challenge God more boldly than any before him, and God would respond by raising up a prophet whose ministry would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. Ahab became king of Israel and immediately proved himself to be the most wicked ruler the northern kingdom had ever seen. Chapter 16, verse 30 gives us God's shocking evaluation. Now Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him. This wasn't just another bad king. Ahab surpassed every previous ruler in his rebellion against God. Ahab's greatest mistake was his marriage to Jezebel, daughter of the king of Sidon. This wasn't just a political alliance, it was spiritual poison for Israel. Chapter 16, verse 31, describes the catastrophic decision, and it came to pass, as though it had been a trivial thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, that he took as wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him. Ahab didn't just tolerate his wife's religion, he actively promoted it. He built a temple for Baal right in Samaria and made an altar for the false god. Chapter 16, verse 32 tells us, Then he set up an altar for Baal in the temple of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. The capital city of Israel now had an official temple for a pagan god, but Ahab went even further. Chapter 16, verse 33 records his additional offense. And Ahab made a wooden image. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. The wooden image was an Asherah pole, representing Baal's consort, a fertility goddess whose worship involved prostitution and child sacrifice. Into this spiritual darkness stepped a prophet unlike any Israel had seen before. Elijah the Tishbite appeared suddenly before King Ahab with a message that would shake the kingdom to its foundation. Chapter 17, verse 1 records his dramatic announcement. And Elijah the Tishbite, of the inhabitants of Gilead, said to Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years, except at my word. This wasn't just a prediction, it was a declaration of war. Baal was supposed to be the god of rain and fertility, the one who provided water for crops and prosperity for the land. By stopping the rain, God was proving that Baal was powerless and that only the Lord controlled the heavens. After delivering his message, Elijah disappeared as suddenly as he had come. God told him to hide by the brook Cherith, east of the Jordan River. Chapter 17, verse 3 records the divine instructions: "Get away from here and turn eastward and hide by the brook Cherith, which flows into the Jordan." Ahab would search everywhere for the prophet, but God had hidden him in the wilderness. At the brook, God provided for Elijah in an extraordinary way. Chapter 17, verse 4 describes the miraculous arrangement. "And it will be that you shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." Ravens were unclean birds according to Jewish law, yet God used them to sustain his prophet with bread and meat twice daily. Every morning and evening, the ravens brought Elijah food while he drank from the brook. This continued for months as the drought tightened its grip on Israel. But eventually, even the brook Cherith began to dry up. Chapter 17, verse 7 tells us, "And it happened after a while that the brook dried up, because there had been no rain in the land." God's judgment was so complete that even Elijah's water source disappeared. When the brook dried up, God gave Elijah new instructions that must have surprised him. Instead of sending him to another hiding place in Israel, God directed him to go to Zarephath, a city in Sidon, the very homeland of Queen Jezebel. Chapter 17, verse 9 records the command, "Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. See, I have commanded a widow there to provide for you." When Elijah reached the city gate of Zarephath, he saw a woman gathering sticks for firewood. This was the widow God had chosen to care for his prophet, though she didn't know it yet. Elijah approached her with a simple request for water, and she agreed to help him. But then he asked for something more difficult: food. The widow's response revealed the desperate situation throughout the region. Chapter 17, verse 12 contains her heartbreaking explanation. "So she said, 'As the Lord your God lives, I do not have bread, only a handful of flour in a bin and a little oil in a jar. And see, I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die.'" This foreign woman was preparing the last meal she and her son would ever eat. The drought had devastated the entire region, not just Israel. Yet Elijah made what seemed like an impossible request. He asked her to make him a small cake first, then prepare food for herself and her son. Elijah's promise must have sounded incredible to the starving widow. Chapter 17, verse 14 records his guarantee, "For thus says the Lord God of Israel, the bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." Her meager supplies would last until the drought ended. The widow chose to believe God's prophet despite the impossibility of his promise. Chapter 17, verse 15 tells us, "So she went away and did according to the word of Elijah, and she and he and her household ate for many days." Every day there was just enough flour and oil for their needs. Never more, never less, but always sufficient. Chapter 17, verse 16 confirms the miracle. The bin of flour was not used up, nor did the jar of oil run dry, according to the word of the Lord which he spoke by Elijah. For months, God multiplied the widow's small supply to sustain 3 people through the worst famine in memory. But then, tragedy struck the widow's household. Her son became seriously ill and died. The woman who had shown such faith now turned on Elijah with bitter questions. Chapter 17, verse 18 records her anguish. "So she said to Elijah, 'What have I to do with you, O man of God? Have you come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to kill my son?' Elijah took the dead boy from his mother's arms and carried him up to his room. There, alone with the child, he cried out to God in desperation. Chapter 17, verse 20 contains his anguished prayer. "And he cried out to the Lord and said, 'O Lord my God, have you also brought tragedy on the widow with whom I lodged by killing her son?' Then Elijah stretched himself out on the child 3 times and prayed again. Chapter 17 verse 21 records his plea. And he stretched himself out on the child 3 times and cried out to the Lord and said, O Lord my God, I pray, let this child's soul come back to him. God heard his prophet's prayer and performed an incredible miracle. Chapter 17 verse 22 tells us, Then the Lord heard the voice of Elijah, and the soul of the child came back to him, and he revived. This was the first recorded resurrection in the Bible. God brought a dead child back to life through his prophet's prayer. When Elijah brought the living boy back to his mother, her response showed that the miracle had accomplished more than just saving her son's life. Chapter 17 verse 24 records her declaration, Now by this I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth. Her faith was now unshakable. After 3.5 years of drought, God was ready to demonstrate his power publicly. Chapter 18 verse 1 records the divine command, And it came to pass after many days that the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go, present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the earth. The time had come for a final confrontation with Baal worship. The famine had become so severe that even King Ahab was personally searching for grass to keep his horses and mules alive. He and his palace administrator Obadiah split up to cover more ground in their desperate hunt for fodder. Chapter 18 verse 5 describes their mission. And Ahab had said to Obadiah, Go into the land to all the springs of water and to all the brooks. Perhaps we may find grass to keep the horses and mules alive, so that we will not have to kill any livestock. While searching, Obadiah unexpectedly encountered Elijah on the road. The palace official immediately recognized the prophet and fell on his face in respect. But when Elijah told him to announce his presence to Ahab, Obadiah was terrified. Chapter 18 verse 9 reveals his fear. So he said, How have I sinned, that you are delivering your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? Obadiah explained that Ahab had searched every nation and kingdom for Elijah, making rulers swear they hadn't seen him. If Obadiah told the king that Elijah was here, and then the prophet disappeared again, Ahab would kill the messenger. But Elijah assured him that he would definitely appear before Ahab that day. When Ahab finally saw Elijah, he immediately blamed him for Israel's troubles. Chapter 18 verse 17 records the king's accusation. Then it happened, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, Is that you, O troubler of Israel? Aye, but Elijah turned the accusation back on the king, identifying the real source of the problem. Chapter 18 verse 18 contains Elijah's bold response. And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals. The drought wasn't Elijah's fault, it was God's judgment on Israel's idolatry. Elijah then proposed a test that would settle the question once and for all. He told Ahab to gather all Israel to Mount Carmel, along with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, who ate at Jezebel's table. Chapter 18 verse 19 records his challenge. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table. When the people assembled on Mount Carmel, Elijah addressed them with a penetrating question. Chapter 18 verse 21 records his challenge. And Elijah came to all the people and said, How long will you falter between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him, but if Baal, follow him. But the people answered him not a word. Israel had been trying to worship both God and Baal, but Elijah demanded they choose. Elijah proposed a simple test. 2 bulls would be prepared for sacrifice, one for Baal's prophets and one for him. Each side would call on their God to send fire to consume the offering. Chapter 18, verse 24 explains the rules. Then you call on the name of your gods, and I will call on the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. The people agreed this was a fair test. The prophets of Baal went first, preparing their bull and placing it on their altar. From morning until noon, they called on Baal to answer with fire, but nothing happened. Chapter 18, verse 26 describes their futile efforts. So they took the bull which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal, from morning even till noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, no one answered. Then they leaped about the altar which they had made. At noon, Elijah began mocking their efforts. Chapter 18, verse 27 records his sarcasm. And so it was at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. His taunts drove the false prophets to even more desperate measures. The prophets of Baal cried louder and cut themselves with knives and lances until blood gushed out, but still nothing happened. Chapter 18, verse 29 tells us, And when midday was past, they prophesied until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice. But there was no voice, no one answered, no one paid attention. Finally, it was Elijah's turn. He called the people to come near and watch as he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been broken down. He took 12 stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel and built an altar. Then he dug a trench around it and arranged the wood and the sacrifice. To make the test even more dramatic, Elijah had them pour water on the sacrifice 3 times until everything was soaked and the trench was full. Chapter 18, verse 35 describes the scene. So the water ran all around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. There could be no question that human trickery wasn't involved. Then Elijah prayed a simple, powerful prayer. Chapter 18, verse 36 records his words. And it came to pass, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. God's response was immediate and overwhelming. Chapter 18, verse 38 describes the miracle. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. The fire didn't just burn the sacrifice. It consumed everything, even the stones and the water. When the people saw this demonstration of divine power, they fell on their faces and declared their allegiance. Chapter 18, verse 39 records their response. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. The contest was over, and Israel had their answer. Elijah immediately ordered the execution of Baal's prophets, and the people seized them. Chapter 18, verse 40 tells us, And Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal, do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon, and executed them there. The false prophets who had led Israel astray paid with their lives. After the spectacular victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah told Ahab to hurry home because rain was coming. The prophet climbed to the top of Carmel and prayed while his servant watched the sky. 7 times the servant reported seeing nothing, but on the 7th time he saw a small cloud. Chapter 18, verse 44, records his observation. Then it came to pass the 7th time that he said, There is a cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising out of the sea. That tiny cloud brought a tremendous storm. Chapter 18, verse 45 describes what happened. Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain. The 3.5-year drought was finally over, exactly as Elijah had predicted. In an incredible display of supernatural strength, Elijah ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. Chapter 18, verse 46 tells us, "Then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah, and he girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel." God had given his prophet the energy to outrun horses over a distance of about 20 miles. But when Ahab told Jezebel everything that had happened, including the execution of her prophets, the queen's reaction was swift and deadly. Chapter 19, verse 2 records her threatening message to Elijah. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." The threat that should have seemed ridiculous after God's demonstration of power on Mount Carmel instead terrified Elijah completely. The prophet who had just called down fire from heaven and ended a 3-year drought was suddenly afraid of one angry woman. Chapter 19, verse 3 describes his reaction. "And when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there." Elijah fled alone into the wilderness beyond Beersheba, completely overwhelmed by fear and depression. After walking a day's journey into the desert, he sat down under a broom tree and asked to die. Chapter 19, verse 4 records his desperate prayer. "But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree, and he prayed that he might die, and said, 'It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers.'" The great prophet was experiencing complete burnout and emotional collapse. He had given everything he had in the confrontation with Baal worship, and now he felt totally alone and defeated. Instead of celebrating victory, Elijah wanted to die in the wilderness. God's response to his discouraged servant was gentle and practical. An angel appeared and provided food and water, then let Elijah sleep. Chapter 19, verse 5 tells us, "Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, 'Arise and eat.'" God didn't scold his prophet for being afraid. He took care of his basic needs. When Elijah looked around, he found a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. After eating and drinking, he lay down again and slept. The angel returned a second time with the same message. But this time he explained why Elijah needed to eat. Chapter 19, verse 7 records the angelic instruction, "And the angel of the Lord came back the second time and touched him and said, 'Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you.'" Strengthened by the food the angel provided, Elijah traveled 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, where Moses had received the 10 Commandments. Chapter 19, verse 8 tells us, "So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God." God was bringing his discouraged prophet to the same place where he had revealed himself to Moses. When Elijah reached Mount Horeb, he found a cave and spent the night there. In the morning, God spoke to him with a simple question that went straight to the heart of his problem. Chapter 19, verse 9 records the divine inquiry. "And there he went into a cave and spent the night in that place. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' Elijah poured out his heart to God, expressing all his frustration and loneliness. Chapter 19, verse 10 contains his complaint. "So he said, 'I have been very zealous for the Lord God of hosts, for the children of Israel have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they seek to take my life.'" The prophet felt completely isolated and believed he was the only faithful person left in Israel. God's response was to demonstrate his presence in a powerful way. He told Elijah to stand on the mountain because he was about to pass by. What happened next was an incredible display of natural forces. Chapter 19, verse 11 describes the scene. Then he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake that shook the entire mountain, but God wasn't in the earthquake either. Then came fire, but once again, God wasn't in the dramatic display. Chapter 19, verse 12 tells us what happened next. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire, and after the fire a still small voice. When Elijah heard that gentle whisper, he immediately wrapped his face in his mantle and stood at the entrance of the cave. He understood that God was speaking to him not through dramatic displays of power, but through a quiet, gentle voice that required careful listening. God asked him the same question again, and Elijah gave the same answer about being the only faithful person left. But this time, God gave him specific assignments that would address his sense of isolation and purposelessness. Chapter 19, verse 15 records the first commission. Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, anoint Hazael as king over Syria." The second assignment was to anoint Jehu as king over Israel, and the third was to anoint Elisha as his own successor as prophet. Chapter 19, verse 16 contains these instructions. "Also you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah, you shall anoint as prophet in your place." God also corrected Elijah's mistaken belief that he was alone in his faithfulness. Chapter 19, verse 18 reveals the encouraging truth, "Yet I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Elijah wasn't the only faithful person left. There were thousands of others who had remained loyal to God. God explained how these three anointings would work together to accomplish his purposes. Those who escaped Hazael's sword would be killed by Jehu, and those who escaped Jehu would be killed by Elisha. Each would play a role in removing Baal worship from Israel and judging those who had led the nation astray. So Elijah left Mount Horeb with renewed purpose and clear direction. His first task was to find Elisha and call him to be his successor. Chapter 19, verse 19 describes the encounter. "So he departed from there and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he was with the 12th. Then Elijah passed by him and threw his mantle on him. Elisha immediately understood what this meant. He asked permission to say goodbye to his parents, then made a dramatic break with his old life. Chapter 19, verse 21 tells us, "And he returned from him, and took a yoke of oxen and slaughtered them and boiled their flesh, using the oxen's equipment, and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and followed Elijah and became his servant. Elisha burned his bridges and committed completely to his new calling as a prophet. Sometime later, King Ahab wanted to expand his palace grounds and noticed a vineyard that belonged to a man named Naboth. The vineyard was right next to the royal palace in Jezreel, making it perfect for Ahab's plans. Chapter 21, verse 2 records the king's reasonable offer. So Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, "Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near, next to my house, and for it I will give you a vineyard better than it, or if it seems good to you, I will give you its worth in money." But Naboth refused to sell, and his reason was deeply rooted in God's law. Chapter 21 verse 3 contains his response. But Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you." Under Jewish law, family land was supposed to stay within the family forever. Selling ancestral property was considered a betrayal of one's heritage and a violation of God's commands. Ahab's reaction to this refusal showed his immature and selfish character. Instead of accepting Naboth's legitimate reason, the king went home and sulked like a spoiled child. Chapter 21 verse 4 describes his behavior. So Ahab went into his house, sullen and displeased, because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him, for he had said, "I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers." And he lay down on his bed and turned away his face, and would eat no food. When Queen Jezebel found her husband pouting and refusing to eat, she was amazed at his weakness. She couldn't understand why the king of Israel would let one citizen tell him no. Chapter 21 verse 7 records her incredulous response. Then Jezebel, his wife, said to him, "You now exercise authority over Israel. Arise, eat food, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." Jezebel immediately began plotting to get the vineyard through fraud and murder. She wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent them to the leaders of Naboth's city. Chapter 21 verse 8 tells us, "And she wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who were in the city dwelling with Naboth." The letters contained instructions for a wicked scheme. Chapter 21 verse 9 records her orders. She wrote in the letters saying, "Proclaim a fast and seat Naboth with high honor among the people." A fast was usually called when some great sin needed to be addressed, so this would make people think something terrible had happened. Jezebel also around verse 10 contains the rest of her plan, "And seat 2 men scoundrels before him to bear witness against him, saying, 'You have blasphemed God and the king. Then take him out and stone him, that he may die.'" The city leaders were too afraid of Jezebel to refuse her orders. They proclaimed the fast, seated Naboth in a place of honor, and brought in the false witnesses exactly as the queen had commanded. Chapter 21 verse 13 describes the mock trial. "And 2 men, scoundrels, came in and sat before him, and the scoundrels witnessed against him, against Naboth, in the presence of the people, saying, 'Naboth has blasphemed God and the king.' Then they took him outside the city and stoned him with stones so that he died." The murder was carried out according to Jezebel's plan, and Naboth died for crimes he hadn't committed. When the leaders sent word to Jezebel that Naboth was dead, she immediately told Ahab the good news. Chapter 21 verse 15 records her message. "And it came to pass, when Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, that Jezebel said to Ahab, 'Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money, for Naboth is not alive but dead.' Ahab didn't ask any questions about how Naboth had died. He simply got up and went to take possession of the vineyard he had wanted. Chapter 21 verse 16 tells us, "So it was, when Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, that Ahab got up and went down to take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." The king was perfectly willing to benefit from his wife's murder plot. While Ahab was walking through his stolen vineyard, God sent Elijah to confront him. The prophet appeared suddenly with a message that would chill the king's heart. Chapter 21 verse 17 introduces the divine confrontation. "Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, 'Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who lives in Samaria. There he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone down to take possession of it.' When Ahab saw Elijah approaching, he greeted him with words that revealed his guilty conscience. Chapter 21 verse 20 records his nervous response. So Ahab said to Elijah, "Have you found me, O my enemy?" And he answered, "I have found you because you have sold yourself to do evil in the sight of the Lord." Elijah's sudden appearance proved that God had seen everything. The prophet's message was devastating. God would bring complete disaster on Ahab's house and destroy every male in his family line. Chapter 21 verse 21 contains the terrible judgment. "Behold, I will bring calamity on you. I will take away your posterity and will cut off from Ahab every male in Israel, both bond and free." Elijah compared Ahab's fate to the previous dynasties that had been completely destroyed for their sins. Chapter 21 verse 22 makes the connection. "I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, and like the house of Baasha the son of Ahijah, because of the provocation with which you have provoked me to anger and made Israel sin." The judgment would extend to Queen Jezebel as well. Chapter 21 verse 23 records her horrible fate. "And concerning Jezebel the Lord also spoke, saying, The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the wall of Jezreel." The powerful queen who had orchestrated Naboth's murder would herself become food for wild dogs. The prophecy included the shameful end of Ahab's entire family. Chapter 21 verse 24 describes their fate. "The dogs shall eat whoever belongs to Ahab and dies in the city, and the birds of the air shall eat whoever dies in the field." None of Ahab's descendants would receive proper burial. They would all be left for scavengers. Elijah explained why this judgment was so severe. Chapter 21 verse 25 gives the reason. "But there was no one like Ahab who sold himself to do wickedness in the sight of the Lord, because Jezebel his wife stirred him up." Ahab had outdone every previous king in his rebellion against God, influenced by his evil wife. But when Ahab heard this prophecy, something unexpected happened. The king, who had shown no remorse for Naboth's murder, suddenly realized the magnitude of his sins. Chapter 21 verse 27 describes his dramatic change. "So it was, when Ahab heard those words, that he tore his clothes and put sackcloth on his body, and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went about mourning. God saw Ahab's repentance and was moved by it." Even though the king had committed terrible crimes, his genuine sorrow touched God's heart. Chapter 21 verse 28 tells us, "And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, See how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring the calamity in his days. In the days of his son, I will bring the calamity on his house." God's mercy delayed the judgment but didn't cancel it. Ahab would die in peace, but his son would see the complete destruction of the dynasty. The justice of God would be satisfied, but his compassion was also displayed in response to genuine repentance. 3 years passed peacefully between Syria and Israel, but then Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, came to visit Ahab in Samaria. During this visit, Ahab suggested a joint military campaign to recapture Ramoth-Gilead from the Syrians. Chapter 22, verse 3 records his proposal. "And the king of Israel said to his servants, Do you know that Ramoth in Gilead is ours, but we hesitate to take it out of the hand of the king of Syria?" Ahab asked Jehoshaphat to join him in the campaign, and the godly king of Judah agreed to help. Chapter 22 verse 4 contains his response. "So he said to Jehoshaphat, Will you go with me to fight at Ramoth-Gilead?" Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, "I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses." But Jehoshaphat wanted to consult God before going to war. He asked Ahab to inquire of the Lord, so the king of Israel gathered 400 prophets and asked them about the campaign. Chapter 22 verse 6 records their unanimous response. "So the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said to them, Shall I go against Ramoth-Gilead to fight, or shall I refrain? So they said, Go up, for the Lord will deliver it into the hand of the king." But Jehoshaphat wasn't satisfied with these court prophets. He sensed they were telling Ahab what he wanted to hear, rather than speaking God's true word. Chapter 22 verse 7 contains his request, and Jehoshaphat said, "Is there not still a prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of him?" He wanted to hear from a true prophet who would speak honestly. Ahab reluctantly admitted there was one more prophet, Micaiah, but he hated the man because he never prophesied good things about him. Chapter 22 verse 8 reveals his feelings. So the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "There is still one man, Micaiah the son of Imlah, by whom we may inquire of the Lord. But I hate him, because he does not prophesy good concerning me, but evil." Ahab preferred false encouragement to true warnings. When Micaiah was brought before the two kings, he initially gave the same answer as the other prophets, but he spoke with obvious sarcasm. Ahab recognized the mockery and demanded the truth. Chapter 22 verse 16 records his command. So the king said to him, "How many times shall I make you swear that you tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" Micaiah then revealed what he had really seen in his vision. Chapter 22 verse 17 contains his true prophecy. Then he said, "I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, as sheep that have no shepherd. And the Lord said, These have no master. Let each return to his house in peace." Israel would be defeated, and Ahab would die in the battle. The prophet went on to explain the spiritual reality behind the false prophecies the kings had heard. He described a vision of God's throne room, where the Almighty asked how to entice Ahab to go to his death at Ramoth Gilead. Chapter 22 verse 20 records the heavenly discussion. And the Lord said, "Who will persuade Ahab to go up, that he may fall at Ramoth Gilead?" So one spoke in this manner and another spoke in that manner. A spirit volunteered to be a lying spirit in the mouths of all Ahab's prophets. Chapter 22 verse 22 describes God's permission. The Lord said to him, "In what way?" So he said, "I will go out and be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets." And the Lord said, "You shall persuade him and also prevail. Go out and do so." The 400 prophets had been deceived by a lying spirit sent by God himself. Despite this clear warning, Ahab decided to go to battle anyway. He disguised himself as an ordinary soldier, while Jehoshaphat wore his royal robes. Chapter 22 verse 30 describes their strategy. And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, "I will disguise myself and go into battle, but you put on your robes." So the king of Israel disguised himself and went into battle. The Syrian king had given his captains specific orders to focus on killing only the king of Israel. When they saw Jehoshaphat in royal robes, they thought he was their target and surrounded him. But when Jehoshaphat cried out, they realized their mistake and turned away. Meanwhile, a Syrian soldier drew his bow and shot randomly into the battle. His arrow found its mark in the most unlikely way. Chapter 22, verse 34 describes the fatal shot. Now a certain man drew a bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the joints of his armor. So he said to the driver of his chariot, "Turn around and take me out of the battle, for I am wounded." Ahab tried to stay in the battle to encourage his troops, but he was bleeding to death. Chapter 22, verse 35 tells us, "The battle increased that day, and the king was propped up in his chariot, facing the Syrians, and died at evening. The blood ran out from the wound onto the floor of the chariot. The random arrow had found the gap in his armor and proved fatal. When Ahab died, his army scattered exactly as Micaiah had predicted. They brought the king's body back to Samaria for burial, and when they washed his chariot at the pool, something remarkable happened. Chapter 22, verse 38, records the fulfillment of prophecy. Then someone washed the chariot at a pool in Samaria, and the dogs licked up his blood while the harlots bathed, according to the word of the Lord which he had spoken. Even the manner of cleaning his chariot fulfilled